I am Ira Paston. I am in the Laboratory of Molecular Biology in the National Cancer Institute. But when I started my career, I was an endocrinologist in the clinical endocrinology branch, which was then NIDDK, and met Bob there. And so I'm very thrilled to have Bob here as a speaker and to have a chance to introduce him as part of the Office of NIH History Biomedical Lecture Series. Okay. Now, the series is designed to provide thoughtful examinations of past successes and failures in medical research to help guide our future. A previous speaker was Alan Spiegel, who I will point out was also an endocrinologist, trained as an endocrinologist. And Alan gave a fascinating talk about the dark history of eugenics in the United States and its implications in these days of CRISPR gene editing that I think we're all worried about. And it's available for you to watch in NIH Videocast archives. I think the most important thing that you probably know about Bob is he won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2012 with Brian Kabilka for studies of G-coupled protein receptors. I could tell you a lot about that, but I'll refrain and not spoil Bob's talk about how it all began. Maybe at the end, I'll have a few things to say. And don't forget, you can submit questions during the lecture. Okay, now we should begin with the science. And the science was cell surface receptors. And at the time Bob came to NIH, I was working with Jesse Roth on receptors, and Bob was selected to work with Jesse on receptors. And because Jesse and I were collaborating, Bob worked part-time in my lab and part-time with Jesse. Bob, like most young scientists then, had very little experience in research, but like most young scientists then, he quickly caught on. He probably could do anything, make money in Wall Street, do science, whatever. So we were blessed with many brilliant people at that time. Another postdoc in the lab at the same time was Harold Varmus, and Harold worked with me. And you can imagine how exciting it was to have at that time in one lab both Bob and Harold. Now, the other point you should know is, and Bob will get into this, is this was a time at which young physicians were being drafted. And one way one could serve the country and not go to Vietnam was to enlist in the Commission Corps and be assigned to NIH. So Bob was among a select group of young physicians who were selected for that program. And all of them were really pretty amazing. Some were even more amazing than others. Bob was clearly at the top of that list. And Bob, like other young physicians, had not planned to do research, but he took to it very quickly, and I must say became very rapidly very skillful and took over managing the project while he was working in the lab. So that is the background for the talk we're going to hear today. Bob has a book on this, which is newly published, called The Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm. So with apologies to Zero Mostel, please welcome Bob Lefkowitz.
Thanks so very much, Ira. I really appreciate the introduction. As you'll hear, Ira played a very special role in the genesis of my career. I gave a lot of thought to what to title this talk. Initially, I came up with the idea of calling it The Legacy of the Yellow Berets, because I certainly am planning to talk about that subject. On the other hand, as Ira mentioned, I have just published a memoir called "A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm," which, while covering information about the Yellow Berets, also tells a lot of, I think, kind of funny and quirky and some much more serious anecdotes about my career. So I thought about maybe using that. Funny thing happened on the way to Stockholm. On the other hand, that doesn't really capture it either. So I thought of calling it A Tale of Two Callings, because I've experienced each of my career paths, initially as a practicing physician and then as a scientist, as a true calling. So I kind of think I'll go with that, but there are really elements of all three, titles, etc. So in terms of my professional doings, there were really two key points. The first, the genesis of my desire to be a practicing physician was this man. His name is Dr. Joseph Feibusch. He was my family physician in the Bronx. He made house calls, and I worshiped him. And I would say by the time I'm about this old, shown in this photograph, maybe 7, 8 years old, I had no doubt that I was going to follow in Dr. Feibusch's footsteps. I was absolutely captivated by the man. He made house calls. He came with that black bag of his, out of which he produced all these magical things: a stethoscope, a vibrating fork, a reflex hammer, a prescription pad. He laid on hands, and then you felt better. And so, although of course I couldn't experience it at that young age, I didn't know the word. I was, by age 7 or 8, felt a calling to be a physician. I never wavered from that, and I went right through my education, always knowing that I was going to be a practicing doctor like Dr. Feibusch. I attended the Bronx High School of Science, which was a remarkable place. It still is. I'm the 8th Nobel laureate to graduate from this one high school. If the Bronx High School of Science were a country rather than a high school, it would be about number 20th on the list. In other words, only roughly 20 countries in the world have more Nobel laureates than this one high school. From there, I went on to Columbia College, where I majored in chemistry, and then on to Columbia Medical School, shown here at my graduation. I want to emphasize that at no point in my high school, college, or medical school career did I ever do any independent research, or any dependent research for that matter, especially in medical school, where we had clear elective periods with which we could use to do research. I always chose clinical opportunities because I was totally focused, like a laser, on becoming the best physician that I could. I'm shown here at the graduation with Mom and Dad. My father, alas, would die only 2 years later, at age 63, of his 4th myocardial infarction, a legacy of heart disease that, alas, I carried. I was diagnosed with coronary disease almost 30 years ago and had quadruple bypass surgery. My dad told me on this day, when I graduated, that it was the proudest day of his life to see me graduate from medical school. And I have thought many times since what he might have thought had he lived to see what came later. I went on to do an internship and residency at Columbia. This is some of my intern class, a number of future academics in addition to myself. I'm pointing to Mike Weisfeld, Harold Varmus, who you just heard about. Who else is here? Here's Susie Operl, and perhaps several others. I would have happily continued on my way to finish my clinical training and go into practice, if not, as you heard from Ira, for the Vietnam War, which was raging in the 60s. I graduated medical school in 66. And as I say, the Vietnam War was raging. There were demonstrations, even riots. And there was, as a result, conscription. Now, for all men over 18, there was a lottery draft. But for physicians, there was no lottery. Everybody was drafted. So you were deferred to the end of medical school, and then you were drafted. This doctor draft as described here, meant that following your internship or a period of residency training, you were inducted for 2 years of service in the armed forces, potentially disrupting your plans to begin clinical residency or continued education and training toward a research career. The Beret plan allowed you to have a further deferment after graduation. The characteristics of that plan are shown here. It was developed during the Korean War. It allowed graduating MDs to defer service to undertake 2 years of clinical training without interruption, allowed the military to draw upon a physician workforce with more advanced training, provided civilian hospitals with needed resident physicians, and allowed service as a commissioned officer in the Army, Navy, Air Force, or United States Public Health Service. The public health service opportunities were at things like the NIH, the CDC, and the Indian Health Service. This slide is courtesy of Ray Greenberg, as are the next several, which some of you may have seen during his lovely talk on the Yellow Berets just a few months ago. The program at the NIH for physicians who were fortunate enough to get into it was called the Associate Training Program, or ATP, which became known as the Yellow Berets, which we'll discuss in a moment. You can imagine how popular this was. As Ira said, it was an opportunity to avoid being in the active war theater and at the same time be assigned to a laboratory at the NIH. So of the 7,500 or so annual medical graduates, almost a third in some years would apply for this program. And of course, there was a very, very sharp funnel such that in the end, anywhere from only 100 to 200 people were fortunate enough to get the call that they were going to be assigned to the NIH. Fortunately for me, I was able to meet the standard and be accepted into the program. As Ira said, it was extraordinarily competitive, but fortunately I had high grades and good recommendations, came from a top school, and so I was able to get into the program. Now the program became known almost immediately as the Yellow Berets, and you may wonder about that. Of course, it was obviously initially meant as a pejorative moniker, but quite frankly, it came to be seen, especially by those of us in the program, as rather a badge of honor. The genesis of the term Yellow Beret came from a parody song by Bob Seger in 1966. So in 1966, a tune rose to the top of the pop charts called Ballad of the Green Berets, speaking, of course, of our heroic commando forces, special forces. So in the same year, Bob Seger recorded a parody of the Green Berets, which had the lyric, "This is a protest against protesters. Fearless cowards of the USA, bravely here at home they stay. They watch their friends get shipped away, the draft dodgers of the Yellow Berets." He was referring, of course, not to physicians, but for people who were avoiding the lottery draft. In any case, that was the genesis of the Yellow Berets. So those of us who were drafted into that program were commissioned as lieutenant commanders in the United States Public Health Service. That's a pretty high rank, corresponds, I believe, to a major in the Army. Now, unlike this gentleman in uniform, we did not generally wear uniforms. We were in white coats, as shown in this photograph of myself, and that's me here, here's Varmus. So we wore white coats generally at work, whether we were on the clinics or in the laboratories. And the fact that we didn't wear uniforms like this guy occasionally led to some embarrassing but also amusing situations. For example, there was a regulation in force at the time that if you were active duty military, as we were, in uniform, you could fly anywhere in the United States standby, but you had to be in uniform. So that was a nice perk. So what many of us would do is we would join groups of 6 or 8 guys, and we chip in for one battered old uniform, And then whoever wanted to travel by air would wear the uniform. Now, of course, the problem was in any group of 6 or 8, the heights ranged from maybe 5'5" to 6'5". Now, I was particularly fortunate in that I was 6 feet tall, and I was right in the middle of the range. So the uniform fit me reasonably well. But for some guys, they were tripping over the pants, and others, they came down just to the knees. So there were some pretty funny looking folks. But on the 2 occasions I wore the uniform, it was just fine. We also didn't have much of an idea of how to salute or anything like that. An example of a somewhat embarrassing situation occurred to a colleague of mine who related this story to me. He had gone to Washington National to fly wearing the uniform, and he was sitting at the gate waiting for the flight. At that point, he saw what he took to be a senior officer walking by. And of course, we didn't know much about military protocol, but we did know that in the presence of a senior officer, a more junior officer is expected to stand and initiate a salute, which should then be returned by the senior officer. In fact, I had actually practiced how to salute the 2 times I was in uniform. Well, so my friend, a colleague in the public health service, jumped up and put himself in front of what he took to be this uniformed senior officer who seemed to have a number of decorations and epaulets and things on his uniform, and did his best imitation of a crisp salute, which was immediately returned by the senior man. So at that point, they started to chat, and my friend was chatting with him, and the senior man asked what branch of the service he was in. He said, United States Public Health Service. And he said, and sir, what branch of the service are you in? To which the uniformed man responded, well, I'm not in the service at all. I'm the pilot of your plane. I'm just here waiting for the aircraft to arrive. So I guess that gives you a sense of just how much we knew about what the various uniforms meant. Now, in terms of the duties of the clinical associates, we cared for patients at the NIH Clinical Center, and then, of course, we conducted mentored research. The amount of clinical versus research time varied by institute and program. I think my experience was probably pretty typical. I spent about 20% of my time serving on the clinical endocrinology branch clinical service, working up patients with all sorts of fascinating diseases and working clinic. And then about 80% of my time, as you heard, working with Jesse Roth and Ira Paston and learning how to do research. As you might expect, given the fact that the Vietnam War was such a driver of folks wanting to work in this Yellow Beret program, it peaked about 1970, but then there was a dramatic decline in applicants after the Vietnam War ended in 1973. My mentors at the NIH are shown here in this photograph. And again, this series of slides is from Ray. Here's Jesse Roth, here's Ira Paston, and here's Phil Gordon. Phil was sort of the clinical chief of the endocrine service. I learned a lot of endocrinology from him. I want to just give a shout out to Jesse and Ira. It's so amazing for me to see how young they were then. I was 25 years old when I went to the NIH, and I saw these guys as really senior guys, real old timers. But in fact, they were all in their mid-30s. And there can be no doubt that I owe them a huge debt of gratitude because they set me on my way as a scientist and even introduced me to the field of study that would become my life's work. I'm not going to talk about my science to any significant extent today. I do that on many other occasions, and it's kind of fun to get off into some other directions. But to just give you a sense of what it was all about at the time, Earl Sutherland was a few years away from winning his Nobel Prize for discovering adenylate cyclase and cyclic AMP. This slide is taken from his 1971 Nobel lecture, but is actually reworked from an earlier paper which came out in 1968, the year I went to the NIH. And basically the key point I want to make about this slide is that it was known that hormones like epinephrine in glucagon could stimulate cyclic AMP levels. It was Sutherland's feeling, and that of many others, but Sutherland in particular, that this was because hormones were able to bind directly to the enzyme and allosterically activate it. And as shown in this slide, there was no thought, credence given to the idea of some independent receptor as part of the system. But the idea of receptors had been about for decades, but as I say, was very controversial. But two who believed in the idea that there must be specific receptor binding sites for hormones and drugs were Ira and Jesse. And so under their tutelage and using a system which they had been working on in the lab for a while, which was an ACTH responsive adrenocortical carcinoma that was passive to the nude mice, I began looking for ACTH receptors using a technique which was essentially non-existent at the time called radioligand binding. It was a very challenging project, but it really ignited my interest and passion for the area. And after about a year of struggling to get my feet under me, because the research was, as Ira said, was totally new to me. I had no experience with it at all. I finally began to make some headway, published my very first paper in PNAS, and then a couple more to follow on our success in labeling binding sites for ACTH in these adrenocortical tumors, which seem to have the characteristics that we would expect of a true physiological receptor. And it was that which sort of set me on my way. Now, before I leave these experiences at the NIH, I want to give a special shout out to what I'm calling the class of 1968, meaning those of us who went to the NIH in 1968 for a 2-year stint. And Ira mentioned the remarkable caliber of these individuals. But to just give you a sense of that, let me show you a couple of photographs. So this, I showed you before, this was the staff of, I think we were called NIAMD at the time, National Institute of Arthritis and Metabolic Diseases. This is just cropped from a larger photo. But here is Harold Barmas, who was a benchmate with, as you heard, in Ira's lab. We were also medical school classmates, by the way, myself and Michael Brown, all coming in 1968. Not shown in the photograph because he was a fellow in the Heart Institute, was Joe Goldstein. And here's another guy in the same class. You may recognize him. I'll give you a minute to look at the picture. Yeah, that's Tony Fauci and myself. Tony and I met at the NIH. This photo is from years later, of course, is from the 1990s when Tony and I served for a decade on the council of the Association of American Physicians. So that was quite a group. And again, one last photo by means of reminiscence. 50 years after the photos I've just been showing you are 4 of us from that class of 68 when we happened to be at a meeting together in New York City 2 years ago. So that's almost exactly 50 years later, from left to right. Joe Goldstein, Mike Brown, myself, and Harold Barmas. So it was not a bad class. Now, when I finished at the NIH in 1970, the research, after a very difficult first year, really was taking off. And both Ira and Jesse advised me to extend my time and continue working. But by then I had already made a commitment to continue my clinical training, now at Harvard and the Massachusetts General Hospital. And I felt obligated to do that. I had already sort of caught the research bug during my time at the NIH, but I was still kind of undecided. I mean, I had felt this calling to clinical medicine for as long as I could remember. And the idea of being anything other than a full-time practicing physician was still something I hadn't really wrapped my head around. So I went off to the Mass General for a senior residency in medicine and to then be followed by a 2-year cardiology fellowship, since cardiology was the field that I had always dreamed of working in. Perhaps, subconsciously influenced by my father's premature coronary disease. This is just a photo of me with a beard when I was in Boston working as a medical resident. And interestingly, I should point out that it was here at the Massachusetts General Hospital, after 6 months of full-time clinical work, intense clinical work, which I really enjoyed as a senior resident, that I really had my epiphany, because I realized that something was missing. As much as I was enjoying the intense clinical work, I really, really missed the laboratory. And so I realized that I was clearly going to have to alter my career plans so that there had to be a significant research component, bench research component to it. I didn't really quite know how I would do that, but that was the decision that I made. I sought out the chief of cardiology, Edgar Haber, himself a Yellow Beret, who was the young chief of cardiology. He agreed to take me on and let me work in his laboratory pretty much on whatever I wanted to do. And so for the remaining several years at the Mass General, I completed my clinical responsibilities while at the same time beginning to work in the lab again. Then in 1973, I received a fine research offer from Jim Weingarten. He was my chief at Duke for almost a decade before leaving for the NIH to become the director. And when I went to Duke in 1973, first year or two, I really did split my time very much between being a clinician, going to clinics and rounding in medicine and cardiology, and working in the laboratory. But very quickly, the research program took off. I had switched my allegiance from working on ACTH receptors. I made the very deliberate choice to work on, I wanted a receptor which was coupled to adenylate cyclase, and I wanted something clearly relevant to cardiovascular disease. And to me, the obvious choice was to work on the beta adrenergic receptor, which was one of the quintessential models for a receptor mechanism that activated adenylate cyclase. And so I chose the beta adrenergic receptor as my model system. And as the research took off over the first couple of years, I went from maybe 60% in the lab and 40% in the clinic to 70, 30, 80, 20. And, I'd say within 3 to 5 years, I was spending 90% of my time in my laboratory program. And as I said, I'm not going to really talk about my research at all, but I just want to point out that what I spent my career doing was trying to fill out that diagram, that black box of signaling that had served the basis for the Nobel lecture on cyclic AMP in 1973, in 1971 by Sutherland. And so we discovered this huge family of 7 membrane spanning receptors, which included the beta adrenergic receptor. While we were doing that contemporaneously, Rodbell and then especially Gilman were discovering G proteins. And so those two bodies of work were very complementary. I also was fascinated by this process of receptor desensitization. We discovered the components of that, two families of proteins, the G protein coupled receptor kinases, which phosphorylate only the activated forms of the receptor, leading to their binding to beta arrestins, which then sterically block further signaling by the G protein by competitively blocking G protein interaction with the receptors. In the years after that, we were able to document that the beta arrestins do a wide variety of other things, such as lead to receptor internalization, and actually, somewhat counterintuitively, for molecules we had originally discovered as a shutoff mechanism, they also serve as signal transducers in their own right as alternatives to the G proteins. And then more recently, we found that there are drugs that are actually able to stimulate the receptors and then only stimulate signaling either down the Berestin or the G protein pathway, one but not the other. And that's opened up the possibility of developing a whole new type of drug, which we call a biased agonist. The very first of these for the mu opioid receptor was FDA approved just last year. And of course, the biggest surprise was that this family of receptors that we discovered was so huge, now felt to include about 1,000 different receptors in humans, including, ones that you're familiar with, all the hormone receptors, parathyroid, calcitonin, adrenaline, glucagon, on and on and on. But also, of course, rhodopsin, which is how we perceive photons of light, smell receptors, taste receptors. It's really quite a remarkable family, and relatively accessible to development of therapeutics and drugs, which fit very nicely into the 7-membrane spanning barrel formed by the polypeptide chain of these receptors. And so today, the consequence is that there are 700 FDA-approved drugs which target G protein-coupled receptors, which amounts to about 1/3 of all FDA-approved drugs. Now, I want to say a few words about the remarkable academic legacy of the Yellow Berets. So just to give you an example, in 1998, when this data was compiled, almost 1/4 of all professors of medicine at Harvard had been Yellow Berets. In fact, 20% of all clinical chairs at Harvard were Yellow Berets. Hopkins, 21% of professors of medicine. Duke, 15%. But at Duke, almost 30% of all division chiefs in the Department of Medicine had been Yellow Berets. Now, unfortunately, this was the only data I could really find, and it's 15 years old, so these numbers are much, much higher. But at that time, 15 years ago, already 64 Yellow Berets had been elected to the NAS, 125 to the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, 4 of 9 NIH directors, 10 different NIH Institute directors. So really a remarkable legacy. This study showed that Yellow Berets were 3 times as likely to become deans, twice as likely to become department chairs, and 1.5 times as likely to achieve full professor rank than the 2 matched cohorts who had not served in the Yellow Beret program. And perhaps, just the most remarkable thing of all is the whole business of Nobel laureates. So I looked into this a couple of years ago because I had sort of found this very interesting. But so this is a diagram I made up showing the fact that of the Yellow Berets that served between 1964 and 1972, so the 8-year period corresponding to the peak of the Vietnam War, 10 went on to win the Nobel Prize, most recently Harvey Alter just a year or two ago. Now, I have those 10 individuals' names, each included in a blue rectangle in this yellow bar, okay? And then above them, I've constructed partial family trees of who mentored them and who mentored their mentors, etc. And in this diagram, every rectangle colored blue is a Nobel laureate. So what you can see right off the bat is for 4 of the laureates shown here, they actually trained in the lab of a Nobel laureate. For the other 6 of us, in no case do you have to go further back than a scientific grandparent to find a Nobel laureate. And if you look going even further back, you can see that about half of the people in the family tree are Nobel laureates, and some of the lineages are pretty amazing. Look at this one here. Here, out of about 7 generations, down to Stanley Prusner and Michael Brown, the only one who's not a Nobel laureate is Earl Statman. And oh, by the way, Earl Statman trained 2 Nobel laureates, both Prusner and Brown, and he also trained Ira Paston, who in turn trained Varmus and myself. Another thing that's fascinating is that if you go back enough generations, you come to Nobel Prize winning physicists like Niels Bohr, Linus Pauling, Schrodinger, Chadwick, not a laureate, but Leitner, who should have been. So it's really remarkable. And I think it speaks very much. Excuse me, that's my phone ringing, which I forgot to turn off. So we'll have to let that ring, but it shouldn't last too long. I think it speaks very much to the issue of lineages in science. Clearly, there are things which are transferable from one scientist to another. I think many of these are subtle. They're not things you can read in a book, but they are subtle things about how to choose an important scientific problem, whether to persist in pursuing something or give it up. You know, the old business of know when to hold them, know when to fold them. Whether to pursue an unexpected, annoying result that comes up, or to dismiss it as an unnecessary distraction. I mean, all of these kinds of very subtle things, I think, are things that are passed down from one generation to another, from one scientist to another. And in my mind, this has a lot to do with these remarkable lineages in science. Now, the question that always comes up is, why was this program so remarkably successful? And I think that one of the best discussions or dissections of this was done by Mike Brown and Joe Goldstein and published in a little piece they published in Science, which I highly recommend, in 2012. So first thing they asked is, well, what were the conditions that led to this remarkable outpouring of top scientists and Nobel laureates from this Yellow Beret program? And some of the things they focused on were the fact that the Vietnam War drove such intense competition for the commissions, the fact that there were unbelievably outstanding mentors, both PhD and MD, the fact that the research experience was so intense, the fact that there were evening courses in many cutting-edge areas of basic science taught by staff scientists, the focus on fundamental rather than translational research, with discoveries strongly nonetheless influencing drug development, medical practice, and human health, the fact that basic science was at the core of medical education, and the fact that medical students were taught the joy of finding new facts or overturning old ones. But they also looked into and tried to analyze what had changed over the past 50 years. And of course, they pointed out the obvious, that there's no doctrine draft or other obligatory service obligation for young adults. The fact that basic science is no longer at the core of medical education. Rather, it's been reduced to 1 year or less. Courses focus on a restricted set of disease-relevant facts with little discussion of where these facts came from. There are few scientifically oriented faculty in clinical departments to serve as role models. The conviction that progress in medicine ultimately rests on a fundamental understanding of physiology has been largely lost. An individual curiosity-driven science has often been replaced by large consortia gathering vast amounts of correlative data in the hopes of answering fundamental questions. Now, which, if any, of these can be fixed, if that's the appropriate word, is a subject that one can discuss at great length. Now, I told you that one of the titles I considered was the same as my book, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm. And so I did feel the need toward the end of this presentation to note a few somewhat amusing stories that have happened. Not all of them seemed all that amusing at the time. Now, I waited till I was almost 70 years old to win the Nobel Prize. I was 69. But people have been telling me for a very long time, perhaps 20 years, starting about age 50, that this was in the offing, but it just didn't happen. And there were some near misses when the G proteins were awarded, and perhaps the olfactory system, etc. Yeah, I mean, a lot of years went on. I took a lot of ribbing about it. People were forever asking me, do you think you'll win? When do you think you'll win, etc. Particularly mortifying was this story on the front page of the Sunday local paper here, the Durham Herald. Front page, first section, Sunday paper, above the fold, left column, you see the story. This is in October, the week after they had just announced Nobel Prizes in 2003, almost a decade before I did win. Nobel calling, alas, not this year. Robert Lefkowitz is Duke's best hope for medicine prize, including a photograph. Yeah, I mean, the punchline here should be obvious to you. How many people do you know who got on the front page of the newspaper with a photograph for not winning the Nobel Prize? And that was exactly my reaction when I saw this story appear. Anyway, 9 years later, in fact, I did win the prize. So I had eventually won it. And so how did the local press cover that? Well, here's a local newspaper. Why is this man smiling? He finally won the Nobel Prize. Note the word, he finally won the Nobel Prize. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And of course, it was exciting when I did finally win. I'll never forget this. They brought out a cake for me when I got to the lab, and they misspelled my name, Lefkowitz. But that was a common thing in my life. At least I got Nobel's name correct. Now, as to why I finally won the Nobel Prize, I would call your attention to this article, which I often think about. This is a real article. It appeared in the October 10th, 2012 issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, which ironically is the day I received the call from Stockholm about the prize. I was not aware of this article till 6 months later. It's called Chocolate Consumption, Cognitive Function, and Nobel Laureates. And it's a plot on the x-axis of chocolate consumption, kilograms per year per capita, versus on the y-axis, the number of laureates per 10 million population, with flags representing the various countries. You can see that there's a very highly significant straight line correlation relationship shown here. Interestingly, the only one that's off the line is Sweden, which has got more prizes than they deserve based on the amount of chocolate, which of course raises the issue of whether they've been favoring their own. Now, why do I show this? Well, this is a true story, and I relate it in my memoir, and my wife will vouch for this. I've been a devotee of dark chocolate for many years, but I also have coronary disease, and so I try to keep my cholesterol low and my weight down. And so for years, decades, 2 or 3 times a week, I allow myself a small square of dark chocolate, which I love. In the summer of 2012, true story, it was either July or August, I said to my wife, my lipids are exemplary. I'm doing very well 20 some odd years after bypass surgery. Why am I limiting myself to 1 square of dark chocolate 2 to 3 times a week? She said, you shouldn't. I said, well, I'm going to start having it 7 nights a week. Every night, that's going to be my snack. And so in the summer of 2012, I began eating dark chocolate on a nightly basis. 2 to 3 months later, I won the Nobel Prize. Now, what does one conclude from that? Well, I think there are a couple of things. I think the first thing is that there's obviously a threshold dosage, which I had finally, after all these years, exceeded. But I think the other thing, which is equally striking, is that it's obviously very rapidly acting, because it was only 2 to 3 months from the dose increase to the award of the prize. So I would call that attention to the attention of those of you in the audience who may have such aspirations. I want to close by just telling you a couple of quick stories about some of the interesting people that I have met in relation to having become a Nobel laureate. One, of course, was the President of the United States at the time, Barack Obama. He was fulfilling a long-standing, decades-long tradition of the President of the United States greeting all American Nobel laureates in the Oval Office for congratulations when they are on their way to Stockholm to receive the prizes. And he was very engaging. It was a pleasure to meet him. Very humorous, pleasant to talk to. And I remember him saying to us, I really relate to you folks. And there were 5 of us in my group. I really relate to you guys because, as you know, like you, I too am a Nobel laureate. He says, but there is one key difference, he said. You earned yours, and you may remember the kerfuffle when he got the prize, I think, during his first year in office before he really had a chance to do anything. Another amazing experience I had was to get to know Coach K, Coach Krzyzewski, the coach of the winningest coach in NCAA basketball. So a couple of days after I got the call from Stockholm, I got a call from the coach, whom at that point I did not know personally, but I had been a devoted Duke basketball fan since the 70s. And he said, Bob, I really relate to what you've accomplished. I brought Duke our very, very first NCAA championship. You've now brought us our very first Nobel Prize. I'd like you to come down at the Cameron Indoor Stadium and be honored by the fans. And so I did the following week. And there's a picture of me standing at center court being cheered by the fans. You can see it's the students who sit closest to the field. And as I stood there, and they had just presented me, the team did, with this jersey, Duke jersey, with my name on the back and the number 1. And the students are cheering wildly. And there's a long tradition at Cameron Indoor Stadium for the students to sort of chant cute things in unison, usually at opposing players, like when they're fouling out of a game or something like that. So I could hear that the students were saying something, and they were all sort of pointing at me like this, and I couldn't make out what they were saying. But then it came into focus. They were all screaming, "He's so smart! He's so smart!" And at that point, I put up my hands, and that was really quite a high. And there's the jersey, and my wife next to me with the number 1, and a big hug from Coach K, who subsequently became a big friend of mine, and we've gotten together on many occasions since, and we've done some fundraising together. But that's not the end of this story. So 3 years later, in 2015, the team wins their 5th national championship under the coach, and they are invited to the White House to be honored by Obama, who was a huge basketball fan. And this picture, a couple of days after that, appears in the Duke Chronicle, the student newspaper, and it shows the president and Coach K and President Broadhead of Duke, and they're presenting Obama with a jersey. And as you can see, it's got the number 1. Well, now this gave me pause. This I didn't like, because as you can see, that's my number. I'm number 1. And in fact, there's a long-standing tradition at Duke and Cameron that whenever a star basketball player's jersey number is retired, they hang it. They make a supersize version of it, and they hang it from the rafters in Cameron Indoor Stadium. It's a long-standing tradition. So following that, after I had received my jersey, I hung it from the rafters in my office, as you can see in this photograph. In fact, I'm framed between my 2 most prized professional possessions, my Nobel Prize shown here and my jersey. And so the idea that having retired my jersey number, they were now giving it to someone else, I was not amused. So by then I knew the coach very well, and I immediately texted him this photograph. And I said, "Coach, what are you doing?" As you can see, that number's retired, and it's hanging from the rafters of my office. And you know, I'm really not very happy about this. Within minutes, he texted back. He said, "Bob, look," he says, "what were we going to do?" He says, "It's the president of the United States, for goodness sake. So look, please bear with me." He says, and look, he says, "You know, and I know, you're the real number 1. Well, what could I say? I said, "Coach, all is forgiven." So that's how that story came to rest. And then the last story that I want to tell you is another thing that happens when you win a Nobel Prize, is that you get invited to throw out first pitch. I actually was on tap to throw one out at Yankee Stadium and got canceled. That's another whole long story you'll have to read in the book. And they substituted for me at the last minute with Mayor Giuliani, former Mayor Giuliani. But that's a different story. In any case, fortunately, I was also asked to throw out the first pitch at a Durham Bulls game. And in fact, I'm shown here at the ceremony before the Durham Bulls game. The Durham Bulls are a very well-known AAA division minor league team. And to the left in this photograph is Woolly Bull, the team mascot, myself, Victor Zhao, who some of you may know, president of the National Academy of Medicine, and on the far right, Mayor Bill Bell, and they were sort of honoring me, etc. You can see the Jumbotron in the background. I practiced long and hard for this opportunity. I had 2 months to get ready, and so I was really practicing very hard for the opportunity to throw out this first pitch. And let me show you what happened. There's 2 months of practice. Okay, here we go. Look at here. Perfect strike. Perfect strike. I think you want to see that again. I know I do. This has been viewed about 400 times on YouTube, where you can catch it. 397 of those views are by myself. I would have to point it out. But watch the arc of this ball. It's kind of slow. Change it. A perfect strike. Alas, I had actually sent that to my good friend, Tony Fauci, the morning before he threw his disastrous first pitch. I was hoping to encourage him, but afterwards I felt kind of guilty. One of the proudest moments of my life was after throwing that pitch, the catcher, the Durham Bulls catcher, came out and gave me the ball. And as he put that ball in my mitt, he looked me in the eye and he said, quote, "Doc, that was one hell of a throw." And as they say, that was sort of about as good as it gets. This is my last slide. It shows three old rockers standing together. Well, I'm the only one standing. The other two are kneeling in front of me in a faux demonstration of, I guess, respect and admiration. I'll give you a minute to see if you know who they are. That's Peter Gabriel on the left and Sting on the right. And if you want to know what in the world was this all about, I'm not going to tell you. You'll have to read my memoir, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm. You can get it in the FAES bookstore, where it's displayed in the window, or Amazon or Barnes and Noble. If you're interested in reading more about or hearing more about the Yellow Beret program, I know you heard from Ray Greenberg recently in his book, Medal Winners, is also on display in the bookstore. And there is a very nice 4-part podcast narrated by Alan Alda called Soldiers of Science, which interviews a number of us, many from the class of '68, to tell the story. Here are versions of ourselves. I guess these are the photographs that we sent in our applications for the program. Tony Fauci, Joe Goldstein peeking out from behind the yellow. I don't know who this is. That's myself. Stan Prusner and half of Harold Barnes' face. So thanks very much for your attention. I've enjoyed sharing some of my stories with you, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to them.
So I want to thank you for can you hear me, Bob?
I can hear you loud and clear, Ira.
Now I'm trying to turn on my camera, but doesn't seem to want to turn on at the moment. So I want to thank you so much for a very interesting and well told.
Oops, Ira seems to have muted himself.
Try again. And
yeah, okay.
Yes, try again.
Yeah, now you're
okay. Back. I have a few comments, and then we have some questions. So the other thing so start my video, maybe that'll work. What I learned from Earl Sutherland, from Earl Statman, not Earl Sutherland. What I learned from Earl Statman, because I've been doing research for a while, is how to formulate a question and design an answer that could experimentally be done. It was in my grasp. I must say, those are the things that I thank Earl for all the time. He taught me how to, and maybe he learned that from that long list before him. And the other thing that struck me always, Bob, was that the serendipity. Here we were on the 10th floor, you and Jesse and me and Marty Rodbell around the corner and Lutz Birnbaum are, all thinking about receptor, and only serendipity, brought us all together. Okay, so now I'm going to switch and go to some of the questions. The first one was, who were the two women in that early picture with you and me and Phil Gordon? One was Maxine Lesniak, who was Jesse's technician, and I don't remember who the other one was.
Well, I'm exactly with you. I remembered Maxine Lesniak's name, and I'm not sure who the other one was. Obviously, she wasn't your tech, or we'd remember.
She didn't work with me, and I see Phil Gordon, so I will check with Phil.
Maybe he knows, yeah.
Maybe Phil probably knows. It must have been someone in the diabetes group and whom I did not directly work with. And then there are a bunch of questions like, what advice do you have for promising young researchers today who are motivated to make a difference in their work? Or how should one, from Alan Schechter, change training of physicians to recreate the successes of 50 years ago? Or what lessons of medical history would you encourage young researchers to pay? They're all sort of the same question, so they want you to speak wisely on this point.
Okay, well, I think as we talked about, this is a very complex issue. One of the things that I have felt for a long time, and it's a broader issue than just physician scientists, is that I really think there should be a draft. I think, by which I mean, I really think there should be mandatory service for 2 years of all citizens. And I felt that way for a long time. More and more kids, those of us who are involved in education know this, more and more kids either take a year out during their 4 years of college or do 1, 2, or 3 gap years after college before going on to further education. But I think if we had formal programs to interest kids in biomedical research, I think that it wouldn't be as effective as having a draft or a war in getting people to follow these programs, but I think it would be useful. But some of the other issues that Brown and Goldstein raised in those slides would be in medical school to reorient what's going on. I mean, those of us who are involved in medical education have watched this over the last 50 years. But just as Mike and Joe said, there has been a progressive eroding and diminution of the importance of basic science in medical education. In many places, it's down to 1 year. Alas, Duke has been a pioneer, if I can use that word ironically, in doing that, because we've had only 1 year of basic science since before I got there. And so I really think, an admiration and enjoyment for basic science is something that once inculcated is something that would really be helpful. In terms of the question about young scientists, to me, I've gotten more and more interested in the whole idea of mentoring. And that's why I drew up that lineage chart. What Ira said about some of the things he learned from Statman is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And it's the kind of thing that you can't write down for somebody. You can only show somebody. Is what mentoring is. You have to role model it. So when you're mentored by somebody, you're in their lab for a few years, or even if you're not in their lab, maybe you're a little further along, but you talk with them fairly often. You watch them. It's an apprenticeship. So the things I learned from Ira were not because he specifically told me. I mean, I watched what he was doing. I mean, I looked at what he worked on. I can't tell you how many times, I've told people that, obviously there's no more important decision that any scientist ever makes than what do you work on? What's your problem? So it's, to me, it's sort of like being an art critic or a literary critic. You develop a sense of taste. What's a good problem? And it's not necessarily all, at the highest intellectual level. It's almost a gut reaction. I know when I attend seminars outside of my field, which is all the time, I'll sit down, and as the guy's presenting, the first thing I'm saying to myself, is this a good problem? And sometimes I say, I can't believe why somebody would even work on this, and maybe I'll even leave. Other times I say, yeah, this is a really good problem. But there's more to it than that, right? I mean, there's the assessment, and I was getting at this. Is this a good problem? Is it tractable? Okay, it may be a fabulous problem. I mean, I always tell people there's a spectrum, and it determines how you fail or how you succeed. At one end are problems which are essentially trivial, and you will, 100% certainty, solve the problem, get the data, publish, etc. But nobody will care, and nobody will cite it because it was a trivial problem which gives a trivial answer. At the other end are problems of momentous importance, but unfortunately, they're not solvable, at least by you, in any real time frame, either because of missing links in conceptual base or technologies that haven't been invented and won't be invented for 10 or 15 years. The key is to work as far along the spectrum in terms of importance and difficulty of the problem, but not go over the cliff of tractability. Okay, now, how do you know that? Well, of course you don't. You can't. Well, how do you even have a sense of it? Well, that's where, to me, the mentoring comes in. You pick that up by watching a skilled scientist who's making those decisions all the time. Similarly with when do you press on with a problem? When do you give it up altogether? I mean, I had a lot of difficulties during the first 6-8 months of my project, figuring out some issues about radio labeling ACTH and separating the radio labeled stuff from the unlabeled stuff. And I was on more than a number of occasions thinking, well, let's just give this up and do something else. Not once did Ira or Jesse even consider that, frankly, to my frustration at some point. But yeah, all of those kinds of things are things that you pick up from a mentor. So for young scientists, I say, to the extent that you can continue to interact with more senior scientists as closely as possible, that mentoring process can continue.
Okay, thank you. So those are the major questions we have. So Chris, is there anything else you would like to say before we thank Bob and return him to his basketball court?
Yes, no, I'm just glad I was muted because I was laughing so loud at certain points. Very interesting as well. Very insightful. So thank you.
I'm glad you enjoyed.
Well, very nice to see you. And
always a pleasure, Ira.